Margaret Sinclair had never imagined that the vows she'd taken in a Pennsylvania church would lead her to stare at an empty plate while her husband ate his fill. The year was 1878, and the dry heat of Silver City, New Mexico territory felt as foreign to her as the cruel man who now controlled her life. "Please, Thomas," she whispered, her stomach cramping painfully after 2 days without food. "May I have something to eat?" Thomas James, once a promising banker from back east, now a bitter drunk who dragged his wife to the frontier on empty promises, looked up from his stew with cold eyes. "Did you finish mending my shirts?" "Yes, all of them," Margaret said, her voice barely audible in their small cabin at the edge of town. "And did you wash the floors like I asked?" "Yes, Thomas." Her husband smirked, using his finger to trace the rim of his bowl. "I don't think you did it well enough." "Maybe tomorrow, if you're more thorough." Margaret lowered her eyes to hide the tears threatening to spill. At 22, she'd been married to Thomas for 3 years, watching him transform from the charming man who'd courted her into this monster who seemed to take pleasure in her suffering. "I think I'll head to the saloon," Thomas announced, pushing away from the table. "Don't wait up." After he left, Margaret collapsed into the chair, too weak to even cry. The wedding ring on her finger felt like a shackle. The frontier was supposed to be their fresh start after Thomas lost his position at the bank. Instead, it had become her prison. She didn't know that by this time tomorrow, everything would change. The next morning dawned bright and merciless. Margaret rose early, determined to complete her chores perfectly so that perhaps Thomas would allow her to eat. She'd managed to steal a small crust of bread from the pantry when he was passed out drunk, but it had only made her hunger more acute. By midday, Margaret could barely stand. Thomas had gone to town, supposedly looking for work, though she knew he'd likely be at the saloon instead. The water bucket was empty, and she needed to fetch more from the well a quarter-mile away. The dirt path swam before her eyes as she trudged along, the empty bucket swinging from her trembling hand. The sound of approaching hoofbeats barely registered until a deep voice called out, "Madam, are you all right?" Margaret looked up to see a tall figure on horseback, the sun behind him casting his face in shadow. She opened her mouth to respond but found the world tilting sideways instead. The last thing she felt was strong arms catching her before she hit the ground. When Margaret opened her eyes, she was lying on a cot in an unfamiliar room. The walls were wooden and the scent of coffee and something delicious filled the air. "You're awake," the same deep voice said. Margaret turned her head to see a man sitting in a chair nearby. He was perhaps 30, with tanned skin and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. His blue eyes were kind but concerned. "I'm Mason Sullivan. You fainted on the road." "I'm Margaret James," she replied weakly, trying to sit up. "Easy now." Mason moved to help her. "You're weak from hunger, I'd wager. My housekeeper, Mrs. Donovan, is fixing up some broth. My ranch is just over the rise there." He pointed out a small window where Margaret could see rolling hills in the distance. "My husband will be worried," she said automatically, though she knew it wasn't true. Thomas would be furious that chores weren't done, not concerned for her welfare. Something flickered in Mason's eyes, understanding, perhaps. "You can rest here a spell. I'll send one of my hands to let your husband know you're safe." Before Margaret could protest, an older woman bustled in carrying a tray. "She's awake, good," Mrs. Donovan announced. "Now, miss, you'll eat every drop of this broth and then we'll see about something more substantial." Margaret stared at the steaming bowl placed before her, her mouth watering painfully. "I can't accept charity," she whispered. Mason's voice was gentle but firm. "It's not charity to feed someone who's hungry, Mrs. James. It's basic human decency." The tears Margaret had been holding back for months finally spilled over. With trembling hands, she took the spoon and began to eat. Mason watched her for a moment, then tactfully stepped outside to give her privacy. Mrs. Donovan patted her shoulder once before following him. After finishing every drop of the rich beef broth, Margaret felt strength returning to her limbs. She sat up properly, embarrassment flooding her cheeks. What must these people think of her? A woman so neglected she'd fainted from hunger in the middle of the road. The door opened and Mason returned, his hat in his hands. "Feeling better?" "Yes, thank you, Mr. Sullivan." Margaret smoothed her skirts. I should return home. My husband has been informed, Mason said. One of my ranch hands, Pablo, rode to your place and spoke with him. Something hard crossed Mason's face. Your husband said to inform you that your chores are waiting. Margaret felt her heart sink. Then I must go, Mrs. James. Mason stepped closer, his voice low. Pablo also mentioned that your husband seemed less than concerned about your welfare, and that he was in his cups despite it being barely past noon. Shame burned in Margaret's cheeks. Mr. Sullivan, I appreciate your help, truly, but my marriage is my own affair. Mason nodded slowly. Of course, but my door is open should you ever need assistance. The Sullivan Ranch welcomes all who need help. Mrs. Donovan returned with a basket. Some bread and dried beef for later, she explained, pressing it into Margaret's hands. And a jar of preserves. Put some meat on those bones, dear. The kindness nearly undid Margaret again. Thank you. Mason insisted on driving her home in his wagon rather than letting her walk. The ride was mostly silent, but not uncomfortably so. Margaret found herself studying the cowboy from the corner of her eye. He wasn't handsome in the classical way Thomas had been, but there was something compelling about his weathered face and the quiet strength he exuded. How long have you been in Silver City? Mason asked as they neared her cabin. 6 months, Margaret replied. Thomas, my husband, thought there would be opportunities here. Mason nodded. It's a growing place. The mines keep bringing folks in. I've had my ranch for 8 years now. Came out from Texas after the war. You fought in the war? Margaret asked. Yes, madam. Confederate side, though I had no love for their cause, just a boy doing what my state asked. He looked at her directly. Learned a lot about what matters in this life and what doesn't. Before Margaret could respond, they rounded the bend to her cabin. Thomas was standing on the porch, his stance unsteady, his face thunderous. I'll handle this, Margaret said quickly. Thank you again, Mr. Sullivan. Mason's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Remember what I said, Mrs. James. My door is always open. Thomas was on them before the wagon fully stopped. Where the hell have you been? He demanded, his words slurring. Riding around with strange men while your home is a mess. Mrs. James fainted from exhaustion, Mason said calmly. I brought her to my ranch to recover. Thomas sneered. My wife's health is my concern, not yours, cowboy. Thomas, please, Margaret began, but her husband grabbed her arm roughly, pulling her from the wagon. Mason was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to his belt where Margaret noticed a pistol for the first time. Unhand her, he said quietly. The tension crackled between the men until Thomas finally released Margaret's arm. Get inside, he told her. Margaret clutched the basket Mrs. Donovan had given her. Thank you again, Mr. Sullivan. Mason's eyes never left Thomas. Good day, Mrs. James. The warning in his voice was clear not to her, but to her husband. That night, Thomas drank himself into a stupor, but not before throwing the basket of food into the fire. Think I can't provide for my wife, he'd raged. Don't need charity from some cowboy. Margaret had watched the flames consume the bread and preserves, her stomach clenching in despair. But as she lay in bed beside her snoring husband, she found herself thinking not of the lost food, but of kind blue eyes and a deep voice saying, My door is always open. 2 weeks passed. Thomas's mood worsened daily as job prospects continued to evade him, and the bottle became his closest companion. Margaret grew thinner, allowed to eat only when Thomas deemed her deserving, which was rarely. The memory of Mason Sullivan's kindness sustained her through the darkest moments. Sometimes, when Thomas was in town, she'd stand at the edge of their property and look toward the hills where the Sullivan Ranch lay, wondering what life was like in a home where food was freely given, not withheld as punishment. On a scorching Tuesday, Thomas stormed into the cabin, more agitated than usual. Pack your things, he ordered. We're invited to dinner. Margaret looked up from the shirt she was mending. Dinner? Where? The Sullivan Ranch. Thomas spat the words like they tasted foul. Seems your cowboy friend is hosting some town council meeting. All the prominent men of Silver City are invited. His laugh was bitter. And apparently that includes me. Get cleaned up, we leave in an hour. Margaret's heart raced. See Mason again, enter his home as a guest. She hurried to their bedroom to change into her best dress, a faded blue cotton that had once been quite fashionable back east. As they rode toward the ranch in their rickety wagon, Thomas continued to drink from a flask. "Don't embarrass me," he warned, "and stay away from Sullivan. Man looks at you like he owns you." Margaret kept her eyes on her hands folded in her lap, saying nothing. The Sullivan ranch was larger than she remembered. The main house was a handsome two-story structure with a wide porch, surrounded by several outbuildings and corrals. At least a dozen horses were hitched outside and light spilled from every window. Inside, the house buzzed with activity. Men in suits mingled with others in more practical frontier attire. Several women were present as well, wearing their finest dresses. Mason himself greeted them at the door. "Mr. and Mrs. James," he said formally, though his eyes lingered on Margaret. "Welcome to my home." "Sullivan," Thomas acknowledged stiffly, "please join us. Dinner will be served shortly." Mason's gaze returned to Margaret. "Mrs. James, you're looking well." She wasn't, and they both knew it. But she appreciated the courtesy. "Your home is lovely, Mr. Sullivan." "Thank you. My mother would be pleased to hear that. Much of the furnishings came from her home in Virginia." Thomas cleared his throat impatiently. "Where's the whiskey, Sullivan?" Mason's smile didn't reach his eyes. "In the dining room, Mr. James, along with several influential gentlemen I believe you were hoping to meet." Thomas straightened his jacket and headed in the direction Mason indicated, not bothering to wait for Margaret. "May I show you the garden, Mrs. James?" Mason asked once Thomas was out of earshot. "Mrs. Donovan has been asking after you." Margaret hesitated, then nodded. "I would like to thank her for her kindness that day." The garden behind the house was small but well tended, with herbs and vegetables growing in neat rows. Mrs. Donovan was setting out additional plates on a long table beneath a pergola covered in climbing roses. "Margaret, dear," the older woman exclaimed, abandoning her task to embrace her. "Your skin and bones, child, hasn't that husband of yours been feeding you?" Margaret flushed. "I've been a bit under the weather, that's all." Mrs. Donovan exchanged a look with Mason. "Well, you'll eat properly tonight, I promise you that. The meeting inside is mostly for show," Mason explained. "The real discussions happen over dinner. I've invited the mayor, the bank president, the mine owner, and several other influential men. Your husband seemed interested in making connections." "He's looking for work," Margaret said. "He was a banker back east." Mason nodded. "I know, I made inquiries." At her surprised look, he added, "Silver City is small but growing. We need capable men. If your husband is qualified, perhaps he can find his place here." The kindness of this gesture, trying to help the man who treated his wife so poorly, touched Margaret deeply. "Thank you, Mr. Sullivan." "Mason, please." His eyes were warm. "At least when we're among friends." The dinner was the most elaborate affair Margaret had attended since leaving Pennsylvania. The long table in the garden was laden with roast beef, potatoes, fresh vegetables, and 3 different kinds of pie for dessert. Nearly 20 people were seated around it, talking and laughing in the warm evening air, lanterns casting a golden glow over everything. When everyone was settled, Mason stood at the head of the table. His eyes found Margaret seated halfway down beside Thomas, who was already on his 3rd glass of whiskey. "Before we begin," Mason announced, "I'd like to invite Mrs. James to be served first this evening." A murmur of surprise rippled through the gathering. It was customary for the most important man present, usually the host, to be served first, followed by other men of standing, then the women. Thomas's face darkened. "That's not necessary, Sullivan." "I insist," Mason said pleasantly, but with steel beneath his words. "Mrs. James, please, Mrs." Donovan appeared at Margaret's elbow with a heaping plate of food. "Here you are, dear," she said loudly enough for all to hear. "A woman needs her strength." Margaret felt every eye upon her as she accepted the plate with trembling hands. "Thank you," she whispered. Thomas was seething beside her, but in such distinguished company, he could do nothing but fume silently. The dinner proceeded, with conversation flowing around topics from mining prospects to the railroad that might someday reach Silver City. Margaret ate every bite on her plate, accepting seconds when Mrs. Donovan insisted. It was more food than she'd had in weeks. Midway through the meal, the bank president, Mr. Holloway, addressed Thomas directly. "James, Sullivan tells me you have experience in banking. We might have a position opening at our establishment." Thomas straightened, suddenly alert. Is that so? I was senior clerk at Merchants Bank of Pennsylvania for 5 years. Were you indeed? Mr. Holloway looked interested. We should speak further after dinner. Margaret watched hope flicker across her husband's face, the first positive emotion she'd seen there in months. Mason caught her eye from across the table and gave her a small nod. As the evening wound down, Margaret found herself alone on the porch while Thomas was deep in conversation with Mr. Holloway inside. The night air was cool and refreshing after the stuffiness of too many bodies in the garden. "May I join you?" Mason's voice came from behind her. Margaret turned, smiling. "Of course, it's your porch after all," Mason chuckled, coming to stand beside her at the railing. "You seem to enjoy the dinner." "It was wonderful," she said sincerely, "and very kind of you to arrange that meeting for Thomas." "Mr. Holloway seems genuinely interested. Your husband has skills this town needs," Mason said diplomatically. "If he secures this position, perhaps things will improve for both of you." Margaret looked down at her hands. "Perhaps." They stood in silence for a moment, the night sounds of the ranch, distant lowing of cattle, the nickering of horses in the corral, the chirp of crickets washing over them. "Mrs. James Margaret," Mason began, his voice low, "if you ever need help of any kind, Mason." Thomas's voice boomed as he stepped onto the porch, his face flushed with whiskey and excitement. "Your introduction paid off. Holloway wants me to start at the bank next Monday." Mason turned, his expression neutral. "Congratulations, James. It's good to have skilled men in Silver City." Thomas put his arm around Margaret's shoulders, squeezing too tightly. "Time to head home, wife. Need to rest up before my new position." Margaret nodded, though the thought of returning to their cabin filled her with dread. "Thank you for a lovely evening, Mr. Sullivan." "My pleasure, Mrs. James." Mason's eyes held hers for a moment longer than necessary. "And remember, you're always welcome here. Both of you," he added, though they all knew the invitation was meant primarily for her. On the ride home, Thomas was uncharacteristically cheerful, making plans for what he'd do with his first paycheck. "We'll need better clothes if I'm to be a bank employee again," he said. "Can't have my wife looking like a pauper." Margaret stared at the dark road ahead. "Does this mean we're staying in Silver City?" "Of course we are. This is our chance, Margaret. Things will be different now, you'll see." She wanted to believe him, wanted to think that steady work would bring back the man she'd married, not the cruel stranger he'd become. But as they arrived home and Thomas immediately reached for the bottle to celebrate, that hope dimmed. The next morning, Thomas was up before dawn, surprising Margaret by making coffee and even offering her a piece of the bread that remained. "Eat up," he said. "Can't have my wife fainting in the streets again. What would people think of me?" Margaret accepted the food silently, recognizing that his concern was for appearances, not for her welfare. "I'll be in town today," Thomas continued. "Need to speak with Holloway about specifics. You stay here and get this place in order. It's a disgrace." After he left, Margaret stood in the doorway of their cabin, looking at the dusty yard and the peeling paint. He was right, their home was shabby compared to the others in Silver City. But how could she maintain it properly when she barely had energy to stand most days? With determination born of fresh hope, Margaret set to work. Perhaps if Thomas saw her trying, he'd continue this slightly improved behavior. Perhaps they could start anew. By late afternoon, she had swept, scrubbed, and organized until the cabin's interior gleamed. Her stomach growled painfully, the small piece of bread long since digested, but she ignored it, focusing instead on hanging the freshly washed curtains. The sound of hoofbeats made her turn. Through the window, she saw a rider approaching, not Thomas, but Mason Sullivan. Margaret smoothed her hair and brushed dust from her skirt before stepping outside. "Mr. Sullivan, this is unexpected." Mason tipped his hat, dismounting with easy grace. "Mrs. James. I was passing by and thought I'd check on you." He lifted a cloth-covered basket from his saddlebag. "Mrs. Donovan insisted I bring this. She said you didn't get enough pie last night." Margaret smiled despite herself. "That's very kind, but I couldn't possibly. She'll ask me about it when I return," Mason interrupted gently. "I'd rather not face her disappointment." The basket contained not just pie, but fresh bread, cheese, and dried beef, enough food for several days. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Mr. Sullivan, I don't know how to thank you." Mason's expression grew serious. You could start by calling me Mason, at least when we're alone. Mason, she repeated, the name feeling strangely intimate on her lips. Won't you come in? I can make coffee. He hesitated, then nodded. Just for a moment. Inside, Mason looked around at the freshly cleaned cabin. You've been busy. Thomas starts his new position Monday, Margaret explained, putting water on to boil. I want everything to be perfect. Mason watched her move about the small kitchen. And how are things with Thomas? Better, I hope. Margaret busied herself with the coffee grounds. He's hopeful about the job. I think it will make a difference. Margaret, Mason's voice was so gentle it nearly broke her. Look at me. She turned reluctantly, unable to hide the truth in her eyes. Mason stepped closer. Has he hurt you? Not physically, she whispered. Not usually. His jaw tightened. And the food, has he been feeding you properly? Margaret looked away. He will now, I'm sure of it. With the job, that wasn't my question, Mason said firmly. Before she could answer, the door banged open. Thomas stood there, his face contorted with rage. What the hell is this? He demanded. I get home early to surprise my wife, and I find her entertaining another man. It's not what you think, Margaret said quickly. Mr. Sullivan just brought some leftover food from the dinner. Shut up, Thomas roared, advancing into the room. You think I don't see what's happening, the way he looks at you, the way he served you first at dinner to humiliate me. Mason stepped between them. Mr. James, you're upset. Perhaps we should discuss this when you're calmer. Get out of my house, Thomas snarled, and stay away from my wife. I'll go, Mason agreed, if Mrs. James asks me to. All eyes turned to Margaret. She stood frozen, the coffee forgotten behind her. Thomas, please, she began. There's nothing improper happening here. Choose, Thomas said coldly. Him or me, right now. That's not fair, Margaret protested. Mr. Sullivan has only been kind to us both. He helped you get the bank position, Thomas laughed bitterly. So I'd be indebted to him, so he could sneak behind my back with my wife. That's enough, Mason said, his voice dangerously quiet. You're drunk, James, again. Is this how you repay the opportunity Mr. Holloway offered? By showing up to your own home intoxicated in the middle of the day. Thomas lunged at Mason, swinging wildly. Mason sidestepped easily, causing Thomas to crash into the table. Stop it, Margaret cried. Both of you, Mason backed away, hands raised. I'm leaving. But Margaret, he turned to her, ignoring Thomas's curses. You don't have to stay here, you have choices. After he left, Thomas rounded on Margaret, his face purple with rage. Choices? You have no choices, you're my wife. Thomas, please, Margaret begged. Nothing happened. He was just being neighborly. Neighborly, Thomas laughed harshly. He wants you in his bed, you stupid woman, and you're too naive to see it. That's not true, Margaret said, though a part of her wondered if there wasn't something in Mason's eyes when he looked at her, something more than mere kindness. Thomas grabbed the basket Mason had brought, appending it onto the floor. No more charity, he spat, grinding the food under his boot. No more Sullivan. You're forbidden to see him. You can't forbid me from seeing anyone, Margaret said, finding courage she didn't know she possessed. And you can't keep wasting food when we barely have enough. The back of Thomas's hand connected with her cheek before she could react. The force knocked her against the stove, where the forgotten coffee pot tipped, scalding water pouring over her arm. Margaret cried out in pain, clutching her burned skin. Thomas stared at her, momentary shock on his face before it hardened again. Look what you made me do, he said, as if she'd forced his hand. Clean up this mess. I'm going back to town. After he stormed out, Margaret sank to the floor, cradling her burned arm and letting tears flow freely. The red mark on her cheek throbbed in time with her racing heart. On the floor around her lay the ruined food that could have sustained her for days. In that moment, something broke inside Margaret. Not her spirit, but the chains of obligation that had kept her bound to a man who had ceased to love her, if he ever truly had. With shaking hands, she gathered what food could be salvaged, wrapping it in a clean cloth. Then she packed a small bag with her few personal possessions, a hairbrush, a change of clothes, a locket containing a portrait of her parents, long dead now. Margaret had no family left to return to in Pennsylvania, no money of her own, but she had her youth, her health fragile as it currently was, and her determination. And perhaps, she thought with a flutter in her chest, she had a friend in Mason Sullivan. Night was falling as Margaret walked away from the cabin, not looking back. Her arm throbbed painfully where the water had scalded her, and her legs trembled with each step. But the road to the Sullivan Ranch beckoned, and with it, the promise of safety. She had gone perhaps a mile when she heard hoofbeats behind her. Fear seized her. Was it Thomas coming to drag her home? But when she turned, it was Mason approaching, his face grim in the fading light. He pulled his horse to a stop beside her. "Margaret," he said, dismounting quickly. "What happened? Your face," she touched her cheek self-consciously. "Thomas was angry after you left." Mason's expression darkened. "He struck you?" Margaret nodded, then held out her arm to show the angry red burn. The coffee pot spilled. Without a word, Mason lifted her onto his horse, then mounted behind her. His arms encircled her as he took the reins, and Margaret found herself leaning back against his chest, too exhausted to maintain her posture. "I'm taking you to Dr. Parker in town," Mason said firmly. "That burn needs treatment." "No," Margaret protested weakly. "Thomas might be in town. He can't find me." Mason was silent for a moment, then nodded. "All right, we'll go to the ranch. Mrs. Donovan knows how to treat burns, and Thomas won't dare come there, not after today." At the ranch, Mrs. Donovan took charge immediately, clucking over Margaret's injuries and settling her in a comfortable bedroom. "You'll stay here as long as you need, child," she declared, applying a soothing salve to the burn. "No one will make you leave." Mason hovered in the doorway, his face etched with concern. "Is there anything else you need?" Margaret shook her head. "You've done so much already. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "There's nothing to repay," Mason said. "Rest now, we'll talk in the morning." But as he turned to go, Margaret called after him, "Mason, thank you for seeing me when I felt invisible." His smile was gentle. "You've never been invisible to me, Margaret, not from the first moment I saw you." The next morning, Margaret woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar curtains. For a moment, she was disoriented, until the events of the previous day came rushing back. Her arm throbbed dully, but the salve Mrs. Donovan had applied had reduced the angry redness. A knock at the door preceded Mrs. Donovan herself, carrying a tray laden with breakfast. "Good morning, dear," the older woman said cheerfully. "How are you feeling?" "Better," Margaret admitted, sitting up, "though I'm not sure what I should do now." Mrs. Donovan set the tray across Margaret's lap. "First you eat, then you rest that arm. The future will sort itself out." After breakfast, Margaret insisted on getting up. Mrs. Donovan provided a simple dress that fit reasonably well. "My daughter's," she explained. "She's married now, living in Tucson, left some things behind." Dressed and feeling more human, Margaret made her way downstairs. The house was quiet. Most of the ranch hands would be out working, she supposed. She found Mason in his study, looking over ledgers. He rose when she entered. "Margaret, how are you feeling?" "Better, thank you," she gestured to her borrowed dress. "Mrs. Donovan has been very kind," Mason smiled. "She's taken quite a shine to you, says you need fattening up." Margaret laughed softly. "She's not wrong." More seriously, she added, "Mason, I need to figure out what to do next. I can't impose on your hospitality indefinitely." "You're not imposing," he said firmly. "You can stay as long as you need." "That's generous but improper," Margaret pointed out. "A single woman staying in a bachelor's home, Mrs. Donovan serves as chaperone," Mason countered. "And anyway, you're still a married woman." The reminder sent a chill through Margaret. "Yes, I am." Mason studied her face. "Do you want to return to him?" "No," she said, surprising herself with how quickly and firmly the word came. "But I don't see what choice I have. I have no money, no family." "You could file for divorce," Mason suggested. "It's not unheard of, especially in cases of cruelty." Margaret sank into a chair. "Divorce, I never thought." The word itself felt scandalous on her lips. Back east, a divorced woman was practically a pariah, but here in the New Mexico territory, perhaps things were different. "It's just one option," Mason said gently. "You don't need to decide anything today." Before Margaret could respond, they heard a commotion outside. Mason moved to the window, his expression hardening. "It's Thomas, and he looks ready for a fight." Margaret's heart raced. "He can't know I'm here." "Someone in town must have seen us riding together last night," Mason guessed. "Stay here, I'll handle this." But Margaret stood. "No, this is my battle. I need to face him." Mason looked like he wanted to argue, but nodded. "I'll be right beside you." They stepped onto the porch together as Thomas dismounted. He was sober, Margaret noted with surprise, and wearing his good suit. "I've come for my wife," he announced, his voice carrying across the yard. Several ranch hands had paused in their work, watching the confrontation with interest. "Mrs. Donovan appeared in the doorway behind Margaret. "Margaret," Thomas called, "come home. Whatever's happened, we can work through it." Margaret descended the porch steps slowly. Mason stayed close, his presence reassuring. "Thomas," she began, "I think we both know our marriage has become something neither of us wanted." Thomas's eyes narrowed. "Is that what your cowboy friend has been telling you, that you should abandon your vows?" "Mr. Sullivan has nothing to do with this," Margaret said firmly. "This is about you and me, about how you've treated me." Thomas had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I know I've been difficult lately. The move, the financial pressures, they've changed me, but the bank job will fix everything. Mr. Holloway confirmed my position this morning." "Congratulations," Margaret said sincerely. "I hope it brings you happiness." "It will bring us happiness," Thomas insisted. "Come home, Margaret. I'll never raise a hand to you again, I swear it." Margaret touched her cheek where a bruise had formed. "You've made promises before, Thomas." Thomas took a step toward her, but Mason moved slightly forward, a warning in his stance. Thomas stopped. "What do you want, Margaret?" Thomas asked, frustration evident in his voice. "To shame me in front of the whole town, to live here as Sullivan's kept woman." "I want dignity," Margaret replied steadily. "I want to eat without begging. I want a husband who sees me as a partner, not a possession." "And you think Sullivan will give you that?" Thomas laughed bitterly. "He's just using you to get at me," Mason spoke for the first time. "That's not true, James, but what is true is that your wife deserves better than what you've given her." Thomas's face reddened. "This is between me and my wife. Stay out of it, Sullivan." "I'd like to speak with Thomas alone," Margaret said quietly to Mason. When he began to protest, she added, "Just at the edge of the yard, you'll be able to see us." Mason reluctantly agreed. "Call if you need me." Margaret led Thomas to a spot beneath a large oak tree, out of earshot of the others but still in plain sight. "What game are you playing, Margaret?" Thomas demanded once they were alone. "You know you have nowhere else to go." "That's not true anymore," she replied. "I have options now." "Sullivan," Thomas scoffed. "You think he wants anything more than to bed you to spite me?" Margaret flinched at the crudeness but held her ground. "Mason has been nothing but respectful. Unlike you." Thomas's expression shifted, something like genuine regret crossing his face. "I know I've been cruel, the drinking, it's made me someone I don't recognize." He reached for her hand. "But I want to change, Margaret, for you, for us." For a moment, Margaret wavered. This was the Thomas she remembered, earnest, seemingly sincere. But then she recalled the countless broken promises, the nights spent hungry while he ate, the fear that had become her constant companion. "I believe you want to change," she said gently. "But I can't risk my life on that possibility, not anymore." "What are you saying?" Thomas asked, his voice hardening again. "I'm saying our marriage is over, Thomas. I want a divorce." Thomas stared at her as if she'd grown a second head. "A divorce? Have you lost your mind?" "No respectable woman gets divorced. Perhaps not back east," Margaret conceded. "But this is the frontier. Different rules apply." Thomas grabbed her wrist, his fingers digging in painfully. "You're my wife. You belong to me." "Let go of me, Thomas," Margaret said, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Not until you agree to come home where you belong," he hissed. "The lady asked you to release her." Mason's voice came from behind Thomas. He had approached silently, his hand resting on his holstered pistol. Thomas released Margaret's wrist but spun to face Mason. "This is your doing. You've poisoned her against me." "Your own actions did that," Mason replied evenly. "Now I think it's time for you to leave." "This isn't over," Thomas warned, his eyes returning to Margaret. "You're still my wife. The law is on my side." "We'll see about that," Margaret replied with more confidence than she felt. After Thomas stormed away, Mason turned to Margaret. "Are you all right?" She rubbed her wrist where Thomas's fingers had left red marks. "Yes, and I meant what I said. I want a divorce." Mason nodded slowly. "It won't be easy, but I know a good lawyer in town. Judge Wilson is fair-minded. He's granted divorces in cases of cruelty before. Will you help me?" Margaret asked, suddenly uncertain. Mason's expression softened. "In any way I can, but Margaret," he hesitated. People will talk about you staying here, about my involvement. I don't want to damage your reputation." Margaret smiled wryly. "A divorcing woman has little reputation left to damage, I suspect." "Not true," Mason said firmly. "Especially here. This territory was built by strong women who made difficult choices. You'll find more support than you might expect." Over the next few weeks, Margaret settled into life at the Sullivan Ranch. Mrs. Donovan became a surrogate mother, teaching her to cook Southwestern dishes and tending to her as she regained her strength. The burn on her arm healed, leaving only a faint scar. Mason was true to his word, introducing Margaret to attorney Gerald Phillips, who agreed to take her divorce case. With the visible bruising and the witness testimony from both Mr. Sullivan and Mrs. Donovan about your condition when you arrived here, I believe we have a strong case for cruelty, he explained. Thomas, meanwhile, had started his position at the bank. Word reached the ranch that he was performing admirably sober, diligent, and charming to customers. He had also begun telling anyone who would listen that his wife had been seduced away by Mason Sullivan. "Ignore the gossip," Mrs. Donovan advised when Margaret heard this news. "Actions speak louder than words. People will see the truth in time." To avoid further scandal, Margaret moved from the main house to a small cabin on the ranch property, previously used by the foreman before he built his own home nearby. It gave her independence while keeping her within the protective circle of the ranch. Mason visited her there often, always bringing something: books from his library, fresh flowers from Mrs. Donovan's garden, or special treats from town. They would sit on her small porch, talking for hours as the sun set over the hills. "Tell me about your life before Silver City," Margaret asked one evening as they watched the sky turn crimson and gold. Mason leaned back in his chair, his profile strong against the dying light. "Not much to tell. Grew up in Texas, fought in a war I barely understood. Came west afterward looking for a fresh start, and found it here," he nodded. "This land has a way of healing wounds you didn't know you had." He glanced at her. "What about you? Who was Margaret before she was Mrs. James?" Margaret smiled, memories washing over her. "A dreamer, mostly. I loved books, poetry especially. My father was a teacher, so our home was full of literature." "And how did you meet Thomas?" "He came to lecture at the ladies' seminary where I studied," Margaret explained. "He was handsome, articulate, seemed so worldly compared to the boys I knew. When he began courting me, I was flattered. My parents had died the year before, so there was no one to caution me against rushing into marriage." Mason was quiet for a moment. "Was he always like he is now?" Margaret shook her head. "No, or at least he hid it better. The drinking started after he lost his position at the bank. There was a discrepancy in the accounts. Nothing was proven, but suspicion fell on him. After that, he changed." "I'm sorry you've suffered," Mason said softly. "You deserve better." The sincerity in his voice made Margaret's heart flutter. Over the weeks, she'd found herself increasingly drawn to this quiet, strong man. His kindness never wavered, but he never presumed, never crossed the boundaries of propriety despite the unusual situation. "Mason," she began hesitantly. "Why did you help me that first day, when you found me on the road?" He considered her question seriously. "Because you needed help. Because no one else was offering it." He paused. "And because something in your eyes called to something in mine." The simple honesty of his answer moved her deeply. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." As the divorce proceedings progressed, Thomas made several attempts to speak with Margaret visiting the ranch, only to be turned away by the hands, waiting outside the lawyer's office, even attending the same church service. Each time, Margaret remained firm in her decision, though it pained her to see the genuine distress in Thomas's eyes. "He's trying to change," she admitted to Mason one day as they rode across the ranch. Margaret had discovered a love for riding, a skill she'd never had the opportunity to develop back east. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing the right thing." Mason was quiet for a moment. "People can change," he acknowledged, "but true change comes from within, not from fear of losing something. And it takes time to prove it's genuine." "You're right," Margaret sighed. "I just hate causing pain, even to someone who caused me so much." "That's because you have a kind heart," Mason said. "It's one of the things I admire most about you." The court date was set for October 15, 1878, nearly 3 months after Margaret had fled her home. The night before, she sat alone in her cabin, a small fire crackling in the hearth, her thoughts in turmoil. A knock at the door startled her. It was Mason, looking unusually solemn. "May I come in?" Margaret nodded, moving to put on water for tea. "Is everything all right?" "I spoke with Phillips today," Mason said, removing his hat. "He mentioned that Thomas has filed a counter-petition." Margaret froze. "What does that mean?" "He's claiming adultery," Mason said, his voice gentle. "With me?" Margaret sank into a chair. "But that's not true. We've never—" "I know," Mason assured her. "And Phillips says the judge will likely dismiss it given the evidence of Thomas's cruelty. But it will be public," Margaret finished. "Everyone will hear the accusation." Mason nodded grimly. "I'm sorry, Margaret, if my helping you has made things worse." "Don't," she interrupted. "Don't apologize for being the one person who saw my worth when I couldn't see it myself." Their eyes held for a long moment. In the firelight, Mason looked younger, more vulnerable. "Margaret," he began, then stopped. "I should go. You need your rest before tomorrow." But as he reached the door, Margaret called after him, "Mason, stay, please, just sit with me a while." He returned to the fireside, and they sat in companionable silence, watching the flames dance. Eventually, Margaret spoke. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that these months at your ranch have been the happiest of my life, not because of the circumstances, but because here I found my voice again, my strength." Mason's eyes were soft in the firelight. "You always had strength, Margaret. You just needed the space to remember it." Morning came too quickly. Margaret dressed carefully in a navy blue dress Mrs. Donovan had altered for her, modest but flattering, showing that she had regained some of the weight Thomas's neglect had stripped from her. Mason drove her to town in his buggy. The courthouse in Silver City was a simple wooden structure, but its presence seemed imposing today. A small crowd had gathered, news of the divorce case having spread through the tight-knit community. Inside, Judge Wilson presided from a raised desk. Thomas sat at one table with his lawyer, looking composed in his banker's suit. Margaret took her place beside Attorney Phillips, trying not to tremble visibly. Mason sat directly behind her. The proceedings began formally, with Phillips presenting Margaret's petition for divorce on grounds of cruelty. He called Mrs. Donovan to testify about Margaret's condition when she arrived at the ranch, and Dr. Parker, who had later examined the healing burn on her arm. Thomas's lawyer then presented his counter-petition, suggesting that Margaret had abandoned her marital duties and engaged in improper relations with Mason Sullivan. A murmur ran through the courtroom. "These allegations are unfounded, Your Honor," Phillips argued. "Mrs. James has conducted herself with propriety throughout this difficult time. Mr. Sullivan provided sanctuary to a woman in need, nothing more." Judge Wilson peered at Thomas over his spectacles. "Mr. James, these are serious accusations. Do you have evidence to support them?" Thomas stood. "Your Honor, my wife has been living on Sullivan's property for months. The entire town has witnessed their closeness. What more evidence is needed?" "Speculation is not evidence," the judge replied dryly. "Mrs. James, please approach." Margaret walked forward on shaky legs, conscious of every eye upon her. "Mrs. James, have you violated your marriage vows?" the judge asked directly. "No, Your Honor," Margaret replied, her voice clear despite her nerves. "Mr. Sullivan has been a friend and protector, nothing more." The judge nodded. "And Mr. James, I must ask you directly, did you strike your wife as she alleges?" Thomas hesitated, aware that a lie could be disproven by witnesses. "Once, Your Honor. In a moment of anger I deeply regret, but it was an isolated incident." "And did you withhold food from her?" the judge continued. Again Thomas paused. "We had financial difficulties. Food was scarce for both of us." Mrs. Donovan made a disbelieving noise from the gallery. The judge glanced at her, then back to Thomas. "Yet witnesses state you appeared well fed while your wife was emaciated," he observed. "Mr. James, this court takes a dim view of cruelty in marriage, whether physical or otherwise." After hearing additional testimony, including from neighbors who had witnessed Thomas's drunken behavior, the judge called a brief recess. When he returned, his expression was grave. "Having considered the evidence presented, I find grounds to grant the petition for divorce filed by Mrs. Margaret James on the basis of cruelty. The counter petition alleging adultery is dismissed as unsubstantiated. He looked directly at Margaret. Mrs. James, you are no longer legally bound to Thomas James. Your maiden name of Sinclair is restored to you should you wish to use it. Relief washed over Margaret in a dizzying wave. Free, she was free. Outside the courthouse, Thomas approached her, his face a mask of anger and hurt. You've ruined me, he said quietly. My reputation at the bank is based on your work, not your marital status, Margaret interrupted. Thomas, I wish you well. Truly, I hope you find happiness. For a moment, something like regret flickered in his eyes. I did love you once, Margaret. I know, she said softly. I loved you too, but love shouldn't hurt. He nodded stiffly, then walked away. Margaret watched him go, feeling not triumph but a complicated sorrow for what might have been. Mason appeared at her side. Are you all right? Yes, she said and meant it. For the first time in a very long time, I think I am. In the weeks following the divorce, Margaret faced the challenge of rebuilding her life. She moved back into the main house at the Sullivan Ranch temporarily, helping Mrs. Donovan with household duties while considering her options. You could open a dress shop, Mrs. Donovan suggested one day as they worked side by side in the kitchen. I've seen your needlework, it's exquisite. Or teach, Mason added, passing through with a cup of coffee. The town's growing, more families arriving every month, they'll need a proper school soon. Margaret considered both ideas. Teaching appealed to her, following in her father's footsteps, but she had no formal qualifications. Still, on the frontier, experience often mattered more than credentials. While she deliberated, life at the ranch continued. Margaret found herself increasingly involved in the daily operations, keeping ledgers, ordering supplies, and even helping with the cattle on occasion. Mason taught her to ride properly, and she discovered a freedom in galloping across the open plains that made her feel truly alive. As autumn deepened toward winter, Margaret became aware of a shift in her relationship with Mason. Their easy friendship had developed an undercurrent of tension not unpleasant, but charged with unspoken feelings. Sometimes she would catch him watching her with an expression that made her heart race. On a crisp November evening, Mason invited Margaret to ride with him to a spot he wanted to show her. They traveled for nearly an hour, climbing steadily into the foothills until they reached a plateau overlooking the entire valley. It's beautiful, Margaret breathed, taking in the panoramic view. Silver City lay spread out below them, the setting sun turning the buildings to gold. Beyond stretched the vast expanse of territory, wild and promising. I come here to think, Mason said, dismounting and helping her down from her horse, to remember why I chose this life. They stood side by side, watching the sun sink lower. Mason seemed unusually quiet, almost nervous. Margaret, he finally said, turning to face her. These past months, having you at the ranch, it's changed everything. For me too, she admitted softly. Mason took her hands in his. I know it's too soon. You've only just freed yourself from one marriage, but I needed you to know. He took a deep breath. I'm in love with you. Though she had suspected his feelings, hearing them spoken aloud made Margaret's pulse quicken. Mason, you don't need to respond, he said quickly. I don't expect anything. I just couldn't keep it inside any longer. He smiled ruefully. From that first day when I found you on the road, something in me recognized something in you, like I'd been waiting for you without knowing it. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. I feel it too, she whispered. But you're right, it's too soon. I need time. Take all the time you need, Mason said, bringing her hands to his lips. I'll be here. The ride back to the ranch was quiet but companionable, both of them wrapped in private thoughts. At the stable, Mason helped Margaret dismount, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. Good night, Margaret, he said softly. Good night, Mason. She impulsively stood on tiptoe and kissed his cheek before hurrying toward the house. That night, Margaret lay awake long into the small hours, her thoughts tumbling over one another. She had not expected to find love again so quickly, or perhaps it had been building slowly all along, disguised as friendship and gratitude until it became something more. The next morning at breakfast, Mrs. Donovan studied Margaret's face knowingly. He told you, didn't he? She asked when Mason was out of earshot. Margaret blushed. Was it that obvious to everyone? The older woman chuckled. Only to those of us with eyes in our heads. That man has been smitten since the day he brought you here. More seriously, she added, he's a good man, Margaret, the best I know. I know, Margaret said. That's why I need to be certain, for both our sakes. December brought cooler weather and preparations for Christmas. Margaret threw herself into helping decorate the ranch house, baking cookies with Mrs. Donovan, and organizing a small celebration for the ranch hands and their families. One afternoon, while shopping in town for fabric to make Christmas stockings, Margaret encountered Thomas outside the bank. It was their first meeting since the divorce, and she tensed, unsure what to expect. Margaret, he acknowledged with a stiff nod. You're looking well. Thank you, Thomas, as are you. An awkward silence stretched between them until Thomas cleared his throat. I heard you might be taking a teaching position at the new school. News travels fast, Margaret said, surprised. She had only just agreed to consider the town council's offer. Yes, possibly, in the spring, Thomas nodded. You'll be good at it. You always had patience for explaining things. The simple compliment, perhaps the first he'd given her in years, caught Margaret off guard. Thank you. Well. Thomas adjusted his hat. Good day to you. As he walked away, Margaret felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The encounter had been civil, almost cordial. Perhaps they could exist in the same small town after all. When she returned to the ranch, Margaret found Mason in the barn, mending a saddle. I saw Thomas today, she told him, settling on a hay bale nearby. Mason looked up, concern in his eyes. How was that? Better than I expected, Margaret admitted. Almost normal, that's good. Mason returned to his work, his hands moving skillfully over the leather. Mason, Margaret said after watching him for a few moments, I've been thinking about what you said, about us. His hands stilled, but he didn't look up. And I think, Margaret said carefully, that some things don't need as much time as others. Now Mason did look at her, hope dawning in his eyes. What are you saying, Margaret? She stood, moving to stand before him. I'm saying that I love you too, that perhaps I have for longer than I realized. Mason rose slowly, as if afraid a sudden movement might shatter the moment. Are you sure? I don't want you to feel rushed or obligated, I'm sure, Margaret said firmly. Life is too precious to waste when you know what you want, and I want you, Mason Sullivan. The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise. He stepped forward, one hand coming up to cup her cheek. May I kiss you, Margaret Sinclair? Her answer was to rise on tiptoe and press her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, then deepened as Mason's arms encircled her, drawing her against him. Margaret felt a warmth spread through her, unlike anything she'd ever experienced. Desire, yes, but also belonging, safety, joy. When they finally parted, both breathless, Mason rested his forehead against hers. I've wanted to do that for so long, he murmured. So have I, Margaret admitted, smiling up at him. Though I didn't always know it. Christmas Day dawned clear and cold. The ranch house was filled with the scents of roasting turkey and freshly baked pies. Margaret had risen early to help Mrs. Donovan with preparations, excitement bubbling in her chest. Since their first kiss in the barn, she and Mason had spent every possible moment together. They rode across the ranch, shared meals with the hands, read aloud to each other in the evenings by the fire. Each day, Margaret's certainty grew stronger. This was the love she had always dreamed of, equal and respectful, passionate yet tender. As tradition dictated, the main Christmas meal would be served at midday. The long table in the dining room had been extended to accommodate not just the ranch hands, but several neighboring families as well. Margaret supervised the setting of the table, arranging holly and red berries among the plates and glasses. Mason found her there, looking handsome in his Sunday best. Everything looks beautiful, he said, but his eyes were only on her. Margaret smoothed her green velvet dress, a Christmas gift from Mason that had arrived mysteriously on her bed that morning. Do you think we have enough plates? More than enough, he assured her, taking her hand. Come with me for a moment. Before everyone arrives, curious, Margaret followed him to the study where a fire crackled warmly. Mason closed the door behind them, then turned to face her, suddenly looking nervous. I have another gift for you, he said, one I couldn't give you in front of everyone. Mason, you've already been too generous, Margaret protested. The dress, a pair of leather riding boots, and a beautiful bound volume of poetry had appeared with her name that morning. "This is different," he said, reaching into his pocket. "Margaret, these months with you have been the happiest of my life. From that first moment when I served you dinner before anyone else, I knew you were special." Margaret's heart began to race as he slowly knelt before her. "I know it might seem fast," Mason continued, his voice steady despite his evident nerves. "But when something is right, you just know it." He opened his hand to reveal a delicate gold ring with a small diamond. "Margaret Sinclair, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Joy bubbled up in Margaret's chest, expanding until she could barely contain it. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Mason Sullivan, I will marry you." Mason slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose to gather her in his arms. Their kiss was a promise, a beginning, a celebration. When they finally parted, Mason's eyes were suspiciously bright. "I have one more question," he said, stroking her cheek. "When? I know traditionally we should wait, have a proper courtship, but I've had enough of tradition," Margaret interrupted with a smile, "and enough of waiting." "As soon as possible," Mason grinned. "Judge Wilson owes me a favor. How about New Year's Day?" "Perfect," Margaret agreed. "A new year, a new life." A knock at the study door preceded Mrs. Donovan's voice. "Guests are arriving, and where is the mistress of ceremonies?" Margaret and Mason exchanged a smile at the housekeeper's unconscious prescience. Soon enough, Margaret would indeed be the mistress of the Sullivan Ranch in truth. The Christmas dinner was a joyous affair. When Mason stood to carve the turkey, he first served Margaret as he had at that fateful dinner months ago. But this time, when their eyes met, there was no subterfuge, no hidden meanings, only love, open and unashamed. After Mason announced their engagement to cheers and congratulations, Mrs. Donovan dabbed at her eyes with her apron. "I knew it from the start," she declared. "The moment you brought her home, all skin and bones, I told myself, that's the future Mrs. Sullivan right there." The week between Christmas and New Year's passed in a whirlwind of preparations. The entire town seemed to embrace the romance of the situation, with women bringing cakes and pies, men offering to spruce up the ranch house, and even Thomas's employer, Mr. Holloway, sending a fine set of crystal goblets as a wedding gift. On New Year's Day, 1879, Margaret stood in her bedroom at the ranch house, dressed in a simple but elegant cream gown that Mrs. Donovan and several ladies from town had worked day and night to create. Her hair was arranged with sprigs of winter greenery, and she held a small bouquet of holly berries and pine. A knock at the door revealed Mrs. Donovan, her eyes already wet with tears. "Oh, my dear," she said, "you look like an angel. Do you think Mason will be pleased?" Margaret asked, sudden nerves fluttering in her stomach. Mrs. Donovan laughed. "That man would think you beautiful in sackcloth, but yes, he'll be more than pleased." She held out a small box. "This is from him. He asked me to give it to you before the ceremony." Inside was a delicate gold locket. When Margaret opened it, she found a tiny portrait of herself on one side. The other side held a small piece of paper folded tightly. Unfolding it, she read in Mason's neat hand, "To my Margaret, who taught me the meaning of grace, all my love forever." Tears threatened to spoil her carefully applied rouge. "Help me put it on," she asked Mrs. Donovan, who obliged, fastening the chain around Margaret's neck. Downstairs, the ranch house had been transformed. Evergreen boughs decorated every surface, and candles cast a warm glow throughout. Nearly everyone in Silver City had crowded into the large living room, where Judge Wilson waited before the hearth. Mason stood beside him, looking impossibly handsome in a new black suit. As Margaret descended the stairs on the arm of Mr. Phillips, who had agreed to give her away, a hush fell over the gathering. Mason turned, and the expression on his face as he beheld his bride for the first time was one Margaret knew she would remember until her dying day: wonder, joy, and love so intense it seemed to illuminate him from within. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt. When Judge Wilson pronounced them husband and wife, Mason gathered Margaret into his arms and kissed her with such tenderness that several women and a few men wiped away tears. The celebration continued well into the night, with music, dancing, and more food than even the substantial crowd could consume. As midnight approached, Mason found Margaret seated by the fire, watching their guests with contentment. Mrs. Sullivan, he said, offering his hand. May I have this dance? Margaret rose, moving into his arms with the ease of someone coming home. Always, Mr. Sullivan. As they swayed together, Mason whispered in her ear, Are you happy, my love? Margaret looked up at him, her heart so full it might burst. Happier than I ever dreamed possible. Later that night, in the privacy of the master bedroom now, there's Margaret and Mason consummated their marriage with a passion tempered by tenderness. In his arms, Margaret discovered pleasures she had never known existed, her body responding to his touch as naturally as breathing. Afterward, as they lay entwined beneath the quilts, Mason traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. Do you know what I thought the first time I saw you? He murmured. Margaret smiled, drowsy with satisfaction. What? I thought, there goes a woman who deserves to be served first at every meal for the rest of her life. Margaret laughed softly. Is that so? Mason confirmed, pressing a kiss to her forehead. And I intend to make good on that thought. Spring came early to New Mexico in 1879. By March, wildflowers carpeted the hills around the Sullivan Ranch, and new calves wobbled alongside their mothers in the pastures. Margaret had settled into her dual roles as ranch mistress and the town's new schoolteacher with natural grace. 3 days a week, she rode into Silver City to teach the growing population of children in a one-room schoolhouse built largely through Mason's financial support. The school had been her wedding gift from him, a way to honor her father's legacy and her own passion for education. The town council had unanimously approved her appointment, despite her lack of formal credentials. You have something better than a certificate, Mayor Richardson had told her. You have heart. On this particular morning, Margaret woke before dawn, Mason's arm draped protectively across her waist. She lay still for a moment, savoring the warmth of him beside her before carefully extracting herself from his embrace. Where are you going? He mumbled, reaching for her. It's Friday, she reminded him. School day, Mason groaned good-naturedly. Tell those little hooligans they can have the day off. Their teacher's husband misses her, Margaret laughed, leaning down to kiss him. Their teacher's husband saw plenty of her last night, if I recall correctly. A flush of pleasant memory colored her cheeks. Their passion for each other had only grown in the months since their wedding, each discovering in the other an eager and inventive partner. True enough, Mason conceded with a grin. He stretched, the sheet sliding down to reveal his bare chest. Will you be home for supper? The men are branding today, so I'll be late. I should be, Margaret said, pulling on her robe. Unless the Mothers' Committee meeting runs long, Mason nodded, watching her move about the room as she prepared for the day. You know, he said thoughtfully, seeing you with those children every day, it makes me think about our own. Margaret paused in brushing her hair. They had discussed children, of course, but agreed to wait a while to enjoy their time as newlyweds before expanding their family. Are you saying you're ready? She asked, meeting his eyes in the mirror. Mason sat up, his expression earnest. I think I am, if you are, joy bloomed in Margaret's chest. As it happens, Mr. Sullivan, she said slowly, I might have some news on that front. Mason's eyes widened. Margaret. Are you saying? She nodded, a smile spreading across her face. Dr. Parker confirmed it yesterday. We're expecting a baby in October. Mason was out of bed in an instant, gathering her into his arms and spinning her around. A baby, our baby, Margaret laughed, clinging to his shoulders. Mason. Put me down before we both get dizzy, he complied, but kept his arms around her, one hand moving to rest gently on her still flat stomach. How do you feel? Are you well? Should you be riding to town? Maybe I should drive you. I'm perfectly fine, Margaret assured him, covering his hand with hers. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, many while doing far more strenuous work than teaching alphabet letters. Mason pressed his forehead to hers. I just want you both safe. You and our little one. We are, Margaret promised, and we will be with you watching over us. The news of the impending Sullivan heir spread quickly through Silver City. Margaret found herself the recipient of advice, hand-knitted baby clothes, and more casseroles than she and Mason could possibly eat. Even Thomas, whom she occasionally encountered in town, offered a stilted but seemingly sincere congratulation. He had remained at the bank, his work exemplary, though rumor had it he was courting a widow from Lordsburg. As summer blazed across New Mexico, Margaret's body changed, her belly swelling to accommodate the new life within. Mason was attentive to the point of hovering, ensuring she rested, ate well, and never lifted anything heavier than a book. "You're going to spoil me," Margaret protested one evening as he insisted on rubbing her swollen feet. "That's the general idea," Mason replied, pressing his thumbs into her arch and eliciting a moan of pleasure. "You deserve spoiling, always have." In August, with the baby's arrival less than 2 months away, Margaret reluctantly stepped back from teaching. The town had hired a replacement, a young woman from Denver with actual teaching credentials, but insisted that Margaret's position would be held for her should she wish to return after the baby's birth. Now, with time on her hands, Margaret turned her attention to preparing the nursery. Mason had cleared out a small room adjacent to their bedroom, and together they painted it a soft yellow. A craftsman in town built a cradle as a gift, while Mrs. Donovan contributed a quilt stitched from scraps of fabric from every woman in the county. "It's tradition," the housekeeper explained. "Each piece represents a different family, all coming together to welcome your little one." One cool October morning, as the first hints of autumn touched the trees around the ranch, Margaret woke to a sharp pain low in her abdomen. She gasped, clutching at the sheets. Mason was instantly alert. "What is it? The baby?" Margaret nodded, trying to breathe through the contraction. "I think so, but it's early yet. No need to panic." But by midday, the contractions were coming regularly and with increasing intensity. Mason sent a ranch hand galloping for Dr. Parker while Mrs. Donovan prepared the bedroom and boiled water. "First babies often take their time," Mrs. Donovan assured Mason as he paced the hallway outside the bedroom. "Could be hours yet." It was, in fact, well past midnight when Margaret's cries reached a crescendo. Mason, who had refused to leave the house despite traditions that kept men far from the birthing room, sat with his head in his hands at the foot of the stairs. When a new cry pierced the night higher, indignant, unmistakably that of a newborn, he was on his feet instantly. Minutes that felt like hours passed before Mrs. Donovan appeared at the top of the stairs, her face wreathed in smiles despite her evident exhaustion. "Mr. Sullivan," she announced formally, "you have a son." Mason took the stairs 2 at a time. "In the bedroom, doctor." Parker was washing his hands while Margaret reclined against pillows, her face pale but radiant, a small bundle cradled in her arms. "Mason," she said softly as he entered, "come meet your son." He approached almost reverently, sinking to his knees beside the bed. Margaret pulled back the blanket to reveal a tiny face, red and wrinkled with a shock of dark hair. "He has your hair," she whispered. Mason reached out a trembling finger to touch his son's cheek. "He's perfect," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "just like his mother." "What will you call him?" Dr. Parker asked as he packed his bag. Mason looked to Margaret. They had discussed names but made no final decision. "Michael," she said with certainty. "Michael Thomas Sullivan." Mason raised an eyebrow at the middle name. "It was my father's name as well," Margaret explained softly. "And I think it's important to remember where we've been, even as we celebrate where we are." Mason nodded, understanding in his eyes. He leaned forward to kiss her gently. "Michael Thomas it is." The years that followed brought more joy than Margaret could have imagined on that distant day when Mason had first found her, hungry and desperate by the roadside. Michael grew into a strong, curious boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's thoughtful nature. When he was 3, he welcomed a sister, Sarah Rose, whose arrival was considerably less dramatic than his own. Margaret returned to teaching part-time when Sarah was 2, bringing both children with her to the schoolhouse 3 days a week. Mason expanded the ranch operations, eventually becoming one of the largest cattle producers in the territory. Thomas James remained in Silver City, eventually marrying the widow from Lordsburg. He and Margaret maintained a cordial if distant relationship, occasionally exchanging pleasantries when they encountered each other in town. The bitterness between them had faded with time and perspective. On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, Mason surprised Margaret with a trip to San Francisco, their first real journey since settling at the ranch. They left the children in Mrs. Donovan's capable hands for 2 weeks of luxury and adventure in the bustling city. On their final night, as they stood on the balcony of their hotel room watching the sun set over the Pacific, Mason wrapped his arms around Margaret from behind. "Happy," he murmured against her ear. Margaret leaned back into him, covering his hands with hers. "Completely," she replied. "Though I miss the children." "We'll be home tomorrow," Mason reminded her. "Back to the chaos and the noise and Michael's endless questions." Margaret smiled. "I can't wait." Mason turned her in his arms to face him. "Do you ever think about how it all began? How different our lives might have been if I hadn't ridden down that particular road on that particular day?" "Sometimes," Margaret admitted. "But then I remember something my father used to say, coincidence is just God's way of remaining anonymous." Mason chuckled. "Wise man, your father." "He would have liked you," Margaret said, reaching up to trace the lines that 10 years of sun and laughter had etched beside Mason's eyes. "Though not half as much as I do." "Is that so, Mrs. Sullivan?" Mason's eyes darkened with familiar desire. "And how much would that be exactly?" Margaret smiled, rising on tiptoe to press her lips to his. "More than there are stars in the sky," she whispered against his mouth. "More than there are grains of sand on the shore, more with each passing day." Mason lifted her into his arms, carrying her inside to the waiting bed. "Show me," he challenged softly. And she did, their bodies speaking the language they had perfected over a decade of passion and tenderness, of shared joys and sorrows, of a love that had begun with a simple act of kindness, a hungry woman being served first at a table not her own. Later, as they lay entwined in the darkness, Margaret thought of the long journey from that desperate day to this contented night. From a marriage where she had begged for food to one where she was cherished, respected, and loved beyond measure. "What are you thinking about?" Mason asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. Margaret smiled in the darkness. "I was thinking that every woman deserves to be served first," she said, "and every good man understands why." Mason pressed a kiss to her forehead. "And I was thinking," he murmured, "that finding you was the beginning of everything that matters." As Margaret drifted toward sleep in her husband's arms, she silently agreed. The journey had been long and sometimes painful, but it had led her exactly where she was meant to be, home, in the arms of a man who had seen her true worth from the very beginning.